So it's a great pleasure being here today to be able to discuss some of the main findings in our book, The Generational Welfare Contract, published back in 2017, but now, thanks to Korea Legislation Research Institute, translated into Korean. I'm Simon Birnbaum, Associate Professor of Political Science at Södertörn University in Sweden. And I will be presenting some of the findings in this book, but also some more recent or ongoing work conducted building on this book. And I will do this together with my dear colleague, Kenneth Nelson, Professor of Sociology at SOFI, Stockholm University, who will take over in about half an hour from now. So I will start by introducing some of the key concepts and ideas of justice involved in this project. So what we are doing here in this book and the work building on this book is to address certain inequalities between age categories or age-related risk groups. I'll get back to some of these concepts later on. And how welfare state structures affect such inequalities and also levels of various important social outcomes in these different age-related groups. The extent to which welfare state seem to affect the levels of well-being and other important things in different age groups. And this relates both to important philosophical discussions and to certain more empirically driven debates on the advantages and disadvantages of various welfare state structures. So what we are doing here in this book is very much to build bridges, to combine perspectives from political philosophy on justice between age groups and generations on the one hand, and more empirically oriented debates in comparative welfare state research on the actual structures of welfare states and the social outcomes of such welfare state structures. One of the important starting points of our book here is that these discussions often take place in separate compartments. So we think it's very important to combine these dimensions of the debate on inequalities between age groups and generations. So I will talk mainly about some of the theoretical debates here in the context of political philosophy on the one hand, but also more empirically oriented discussions about when and why different universalistic welfare state structures succeed or fail. And then Kenneth will take over to focus more on the empirical findings that we present in our research. What is it that we actually find by applying these ideas and concepts and hypotheses that I introduce here. So let me start by saying a few words about the more philosophically oriented discussions on justice between age groups and generations. Now, first of all, I should perhaps say something about these concepts that I keep distinguishing, age groups on the one hand and generations on the other. Often philosophers who are interested in these dimensions of justice, inequalities or disadvantages related to age, they make a distinction between generations or birth cohorts on the one hand and age groups on the other. Now, I was born in the late 1970s. That is my generation, and that will always be the generation to which I belong. So the concept of generation or birth cohort, that's something that's unaffected by my age. So whether I'm a child, an adult in working age, or if I'm old, I will always belong to the same generation. That is the time of birth, when I'm born. So generation is often used as a concept referring to a bundle of birth cohorts, the people born around the same point in time, moving through life together, experiencing the same historical events together, and passing through life to the various stages of life together. By contrast, age inevitably is something that changes all the time. We age, that is part of the human condition. So although I belong to the same generation throughout my whole life, obviously I pass through different ages as I grow older. So that's the central distinction between a generation and an age group. So let me now turn to two main perspectives, or at least two very important perspectives in discussions about justice between generations and age groups. Norman Daniels is a philosopher who contributed with a very important book back in the mid-80s. This can be referred to as a seminal contribution on the topic of justice between age groups. And his main idea, the main idea presented in that book, is something that we find very inspiring and that we build on in this book. And his main perspective was that, his kind of main point of view was that inequalities between age groups, between younger and older members of the community, is not objectionable per se. Normally, we will pass through all the main stages of life, unless we die early. There are, of course, sad exceptions. But normally, we move through the different stages of life. And that also means that inequalities between different life stages or age groups doesn't necessarily have to be objectionable, unless it translates into inequalities between persons that seem arbitrary over complete lives. Still, he thought that there is very much that we can do by way of continuous cooperation between successive birth cohorts. So people are born at different points of time. They pass through different age groups, different stages of life. But continuous birth cohorts can collaborate, they can cooperate to make our life prospects better than they would have been in the absence of cooperation or weakly developed forms of cooperation. They can help boost each other's life prospects by supporting stable forms of continuous cooperation instead of getting stuck in divisive struggles over resources. So what he said, we should not think about the budget available for distribution for various age-related social risks. We should not think in terms of competition over a fixed set of resources here, because we should think that we will all pass through different stages of life. And what matters is that we can help each other out to make our life prospects as good, as favorable as possible. So the main idea that we pick out here from Daniel's complex work, I'm giving you a very brief and simplified presentation, but there is a concern here in his book, a certain efficiency-based argument for why we need stable cooperation between successive birth cohorts and what we want to achieve with this kind of cooperation. And one thing that we clearly do want to achieve is try to establish positive sum solutions, cooperation that help us achieve higher absolute well-being over complete lives. So this is something we find interesting and inspiring, and that guides us to our empirical exploration. Because if we have that starting point, if we take an interest in whether or not and how structures of the welfare state can help support improving well-being throughout life, then we clearly need to have a look at how are actual welfare states constructed and what are their social outcomes. Do they help improve well-being in different age groups? When does that seem to be the case, and when does that does not seem to be the case? So that is one important perspective in the theoretical starting points of our project. Now, Daniels has received a fair share of criticism. Several authors, several philosophers have found his perspective one-sided or limited in one way or another. And we think that one important strand of criticism pointing to limitations of Daniels' view can be expressed in terms of relational egalitarianism or relational equality between different age groups. So the perspective of relational egalitarianism has been advanced in political philosophy over the past few decades. And some authors have also applied that kind of perspective to age categories, age groups. Juliana Bidadanouri is one example. So let us just say a few words about this and why we think this adds important supplementary considerations to Daniels' perspective. Well, there are some reasons to think that perhaps, after all, inequalities between age categories are important, not only when they seem to affect our long-term prospects, our prospects over complete lives, but also when they affect people's relative standing, people's sense of self-worth in their everyday collaboration, interaction with other citizens. At least there are powerful arguments in this body of research in political philosophy on the preconditions for relational equality between citizens. Inequalities seem objectionable whenever they are deep enough to prevent us from interacting as equals across groups. And one important concept often used to express and explain why and when inequalities are objectionable for this reason is domination, that some people live at the mercy of others, or some people are unable to walk tall, to look others in the eye because of living in conditions of vulnerability to abuse, vulnerability to arbitrary interference of others, for instance. So when resource inequalities prevent us from interacting in public as equals, well, then they seem objectionable regardless of their impact on long-term prospects or prospects over complete lives. So I will not say more about this now. What's important is that Daniels provides us with arguments about the need to look at the absolute levels of well-being resulting from different welfare state structures. How do welfare state structures to cater for age-related needs? How does that affect our long-term prospects, our absolute levels of well-being? in different phases of life. That's Daniel's perspective, or that's our interpretation that we get from Daniel's. Relational equality alerts us to something distinct, namely how do different welfare state structures affect levels of equality or inequality between different age categories. So we think there are powerful, important arguments to address both of these set of considerations. So that gives you kind of the background in philosophical debates on justice between age groups and generations. But we also address a more empirically oriented discussion on welfare state structures and age. And addressing that context, we are inspired by an important contribution by Walter Korpi and Joachim Palme, published back in 1998, where they coined this term, the paradox of redistribution, which I'm sure is familiar to many of you. But what they did in this article, or one of the things they did, was to offer a certain explanation, a certain perspective of when and why universal welfare state structures tend to be successful in preventing poverty and moderating inequality over time. Now, this work did not specifically address the age question or questions regarding relationships between successive birth cohorts. And that's something that we add here in our work. But we want to say something about their way of arguing, their way of thinking about universalism, when and why it is successful, because that gives us, that explains the inspiration behind our hypothesis, our way of thinking about when different age-related structures of welfare state support is successful or not. So what they emphasized very strongly in this article was to pay attention, to pay very close attention to how different welfare state structures affect the prospects for class alliances in support of the welfare state. So, and an important concept here is stratification. So welfare states, they don't just distribute resources affecting the conditions, the living conditions of various groups, but they also affect identities in society and the prospects for coalition building in society and in political prospects, in political processes. And this in turn tends to affect the long-term support of welfare state structures. So their argument was very much focusing on the need to build alliances between low-income groups and the middle class groups, that when broad categories of middle class voters are included in the welfare state, when social insurance is made encompassing in the sense of providing adequate income-related support based on accustomed living standards to broad categories of citizens, rather than just being an interest for the very poor. That is what gives us the most robust structure in support of long-term legitimacy for a broadly universalist welfare state. And that in turn tends to be the most beneficial structure for the least advantaged in society, so that the poor need not stand alone. This, I'm sure, is familiar to many of you, but just to rehearse that fundamental perspective, that if we want to understand when and why universal welfare state structures are successful, we need to pay close attention to the stratification mechanisms involved. How do different welfare states affect group identities in society and the prospects for class alliances, group alliances in support or in opposition to the welfare state? Now, clearly, stratification and especially the prospects for class alliances is not all that matters to the success of universal welfare states in combating inequalities, addressing disadvantages over time. Some fairly sympathetic critics of this argument on the paradox of redistribution have emphasized the need to add complementary perspectives. Now, I should perhaps just spell out the paradox. What does it say? Well, the central component is that the more we target welfare state benefits at the poor only, the less likely we are to reduce poverty and inequality. So only focusing on the poor, for example, through targeted transfers, means-tested transfers, that is counterproductive. We also need to include the broad categories of citizens and the middle classes in encompassing forms of income support through the welfare state. Now, this is not all that matters. So some people have said that why should people mobilize to demand support from the state rather than turning to families or civil society communities to address their social needs, their need for security? That takes for granted, that assumption that people should turn to the state and mobilize political struggles, asking the state to do something. That takes for granted that we can trust the state, that people have confidence that states will actually do what we ask them to do. That our money, tax money, will not end up in the pockets of dictators or in bureaucracy somewhere, but that we have a state structure that works, that is not corrupted, that is reasonably impartial in relation to citizens. And this is a point highlighted in various strands of the literature on quality of government. Bo Rothstein is one author prominent in this empirically oriented literature on the universal welfare state, and when does it work and when does it not succeed so well, pointing to this as a kind of key precondition. So stratification mechanisms, they matter, but it's also absolutely central that people trust governments, trust the state machinery, that people living in a welfare state feel that the state is perceived as reasonably just and uncorrupted. If it's not, well, then it's not clear. That doesn't make sense to trust governments to collect very high taxes, for instance. So that's an underlying necessary preconditions in order for a more expansive welfare state to work. And in order for that to happen, we need to pay close attention to how different arrangements affect the perceived justice of state institutions. And in this literature, authors tend to emphasize very strongly the concept of impartiality. Another important dimension of this literature, the more recent literature on the paradox of redistribution and the mechanisms through which more universal forms of welfare support are successful in combating inequality and poverty, is offered by literature on targeting within universalism. So several authors, even Marx is one of them, has recently argued and defended and provided convincing evidence for the beneficial effects of certain forms of means testing and targeting. So in some strands of this literature on universalism, perhaps targeting means testing has had a very, perhaps too bad reputation. Perhaps we have been a bit too unfair in relation to means testing. Means testing can be very important and it can be successful. But what this literature says, what it concludes, is not that we should abandon the paradox of redistribution. But what it does say is that means testing seems to work much better, tends to provide more optimal outcomes when introduced within the context of broad, encompassing forms of social insurance, so that we need a certain combination between this social insurance for broad categories, for the middle classes, and within that context we need supplementary forms of support, more targeted forms of support for various groups, clearly. But we mustn't disconnect these from these encompassing forms of social insurance. And the same goes for more general flat rate benefits. And this was actually something emphasized in the original article by Corpi and Palme, that flat rate transfers, universal child benefits, for instance, can be a very important component of a universal welfare state. The important things to stress here, that these must not be disconnected from social insurance, encompassing forms of income-related social insurance based on accustomed living standards. So that broad categories are included in welfare state structures. So this is the more empirical context for our contribution. So what do we add here? Well, in ongoing research, Kenneth Nelson and I, we use this expression of a generational paradox of redistribution to express the idea that perhaps there is another key factor here, a third factor, that is, in addition to the limits of means testing, the limits of flat rate benefits, that we need to pay very close attention to when designing universal welfare state structures, namely avoid age imbalance, or more positively, try to have forms of support, forms of social insurance where we do not address different age-related needs in very imbalanced ways. That is, not provide much more for certain specific age-related risks than to other age-related risks. That is the dimension of universalism and potential then key preconditions for when universalism succeed that we want to highlight in this book and in our ongoing work. And theoretically, there are reasons to think then that both arguments about stratification, the different groups, different interest groups, the different identities mobilizing for political projects, the prospects for alliance building for various purposes in political struggles. Both arguments on that, mechanisms related to stratification of welfare state structures, and arguments, mechanisms related to perceived fairness, perceived impartiality of the welfare state. Both of these perspectives, theoretical ways of thinking, provide us with some arguments and reasons to think that age balance, age imbalance is important. So let me, before leaving the word to Kenneth, just spell out some of these assumptions. First of all, it makes intuitive sense to think that if we have cooperation across ages and life stages for the security of all citizens, regardless of the particular age group they belong to at the moment, the particular life stage they find themselves in. The idea that we collaborate, we cooperate continuously to make sure that all age groups are well off, that the welfare state treats all age categories more or less equitably. That seems to be something that prevents divisions, conflicts between, for instance, the young and the old. A welfare state that focuses on the well-being of all citizens regardless of life stage, that seems to support this kind of positive sum solution, that type of interaction that we would be looking for. That makes intuitive sense to think that. So this is related to stratification, trying to avoid struggles between age groups, for instance. Focus on the security of all citizens, regardless of age or life stage. Another consideration, perhaps more linked to perceived justice, perceived impartiality of state institutions, focuses on the everyday impression that people have in their lives, the feeling that people may have when experiencing that the welfare state is always there for them and is always there or tends to be there equally regardless of life stage. This is something that should support their confidence and trust in state institutions. This signal that social needs and risks of all life stages are addressed more or less equitably. So there are some arguments related to stratification and some arguments related to the perceived fairness or justice or impartiality of welfare state structures, derived from these theoretical ways of thinking about the preconditions for universalist welfare state to succeed in combating inequality and disadvantage, inequality over time. And based on this reasoning, we formulate this hypothesis inspired by Corpi Palme's paradox of redistribution, but now applied to age categories, age groups. So we're saying that the more we target income replacement to adequately cover the needs associated with specific life stages, the less likely we are to improve the levels of support and living conditions of this particular age group. But then formulated in more positive terms, we hypothesize that age-balanced welfare states where there are not fundamental inequalities in how different risks, age-related social risks are addressed, provide higher levels of income replacement for age-related risks throughout the life cycle, and will tend to perform better in terms of key social outcomes in all age groups. So this is an hypothesis, and there you have the kind of arguments, the philosophical arguments for why we should pay close attention to absolute levels of welfare under different forms of welfare support, but also whether or not they tend to support equality between different age groups, relational equality, and also the various mechanisms that we have in mind for how more balanced welfare state structures may tend to promote, advance these kinds of desirable social outcomes. So this is the topic addressed here. We look how welfare state institutional structures affect various social outcomes through these generational welfare contracts. We use this concept of generational welfare contracts to express this idea that collaboration, cooperation between successive birth cohorts, generations, can help improve the life prospects, the living conditions of all age categories, depending on how these structures of welfare state support, how they are designed. And the outcomes we look at are, for instance, poverty, subjective well-being, trust, and employment. Kenneth will get back to this. And here's a brief summary of what we do in our work here. We want to demonstrate the importance of linking philosophical debates on justice between age groups that I've been talking about here to the welfare state literature on social policy impacts. We also want to suggest some measures and methods for analyzing age-related structures of welfare states of relevance to such important social impacts. Impacts of relevance to the prudential lifespan approach, Daniels, boost absolute life prospects and relational equality. And in light of our empirical findings, we develop a tentative instrumental case for why an age-balanced distribution of social rights, providing more or less equal levels of social protection for all stages of life, tends to be better at providing the kinds of outcomes that we are looking for. So we can imagine, hypothetically, different kinds of structures, some more focused on supporting the needs of children, of parents, some more focused on what we call a pro-work agenda, focused on the security of people in maturity, working age, when they become unemployed or sick, for instance, and some more focused on the needs of elderly citizens, high retirement pensions, for instance. And this is just visualizes what I have just been saying, the idea that you can have a structure that is balanced, that is supporting people through different stages of life, and the hypothesis that the balanced structure will also give higher levels of support and more beneficial outcomes. Before I let Kenneth take over, just a very few remarks on what we do not say to avoid misunderstandings. This is an instrumental argument. We're not saying that a more balanced structure is always better, all things considered. It's an instrumental argument that means that insofar as you can see this positive impact of balanced structure on the levels of well-being and equality of outcomes, insofar as you can identify this, well, then arguably this has very important implications for how we should design welfare state structures. But it's clearly not all that matters, and there is nothing inherently important about balance as such. It's important to the extent that it tends to provide good outcomes, desirable outcomes. And also, we should say that we do not specifically address here in this work the relationship between different birth cohorts. So this goes back to the distinction I made earlier between generation or birth cohort and age group. We are focusing here on age categories. We have a snapshot perspective. How do welfare states address different age-related needs at a given time, and how does that seem to affect important social outcomes? We do not address a kind of concern that is important in some discussions on justice between generations, that some generations seem to be far worse off compared to other generations, especially in how welfare states treat them. I mean, one generation is born into war, another generation is born into a stage of welfare state expansion, and that affects long-term prospects. And there may be inequalities, there may be fundamental demographic imbalances that affects the prospects of different birth cohorts. We do not address that specifically these kinds of relationships. We focus on how welfare states address age-related needs and the structure of that response and the outcomes of such a response based on the various hypotheses that I have expressed here. But there are clearly other dimensions of justice between generations. So we are not saying that balance is always better. We are not saying how the concern for balanced welfare contracts, how this should be weighed in relation to other important concerns. And finally, we should emphasize that what we have in mind here is not a universal iron law saying that balanced is always, under all circumstances, better, that it offers more favorable prospects for everyone and so on. We want to point to a potentially firm regularity in advanced welfare state, but it's a very open empirical question. I mean, the extent to which these patterns are always there, when they are there. So having said that, with these caveats, I will leave the word now to Kenneth to talk more about the hypothesis and the empirical findings in our work. Thank you very much. So I will now address the second question, which is a very interesting and fairly long question, focusing on the topic of changing the paradigm. How do we move from an unbalanced structure, here exemplified by Korea, to a balanced structure? And the question has several components. I try to address each in turn. So the question here is, I would like to know the articles of the Constitution or social laws of Sweden that are reflected in the balanced generational welfare contract and its contents. So first, it's perhaps worth just emphasizing here that when we talk about the balanced contract, it's not just about Sweden. This is a category of countries, including Sweden, but also Norway, Denmark, Finland, but also Austria, Belgium, France. And clearly our approach to this topic is quantitative. We have this kind of bird's eye point of view. We look at general patterns, comparing countries. So that means that we are not doing qualitative case studies. We're not doing process tracing to understand more fully how these patterns evolved. That would clearly be very interesting to do in the future. But when we look at these patterns, these structures in age-related support provided by welfare states, our impression is that the age patterns that we can see, they do not reflect deliberate policy decisions. They are not, at least not fully intended when we look at the balance in these structures. So there's no law, no policy strategy calling for age-balanced contracts. These structures, they are identified, they are studied through certain analytical techniques that we employ in this book, and they are revealed through these empirical studies. What we can see is a fairly established policy discourse supporting the desirability of universalism in general, the idea of a universal welfare state. That is strongly supported from left to right in Swedish politics. But when it comes to these patterns, the balance or imbalance between in the support for different age-related risk groups, that's something that we reveal in this study. Whether or not this could have consequences for future policy decisions, given an awareness of these patterns and that they might have kind of implications. Whether that will happen, that remains to be seen. Let me now turn to the other two elements of this second question. First one concerns what methods and strategies we could adopt to transform competitive relationships into cooperative relationships. The other focuses more specifically on crisis and what attitude and efforts Sweden is adopting and making towards internal and external environmental impacts. So when it comes to this second part of the question, we would approach the Korean situation with great humility. Obviously, we're no experts on South Korea, and one very important factor when it comes to developing successful strategies is sensitivity to the social and historical circumstances addressed. So there's clearly no uniform blueprint for success, something that can just be mechanically applied to every context. So we will make no strong claims about Korea specifically, but the general perspective that we advance in this book is that we need to address these kinds of situations holistically. We must not look at specific age-related risks or specific age groups in isolation from other age groups. We need to look at the interaction between age categories and to try to build inclusive structures. And an important element of a successful strategy, we think, is to look carefully at this idea of contingent consent, that if we ask, for instance, working age population to consent to increasing burdens, to pay an increasing burden, to contribute more, in this case, for the costs of elderly care and things like that, well, then it's also always important to think, do they have reasons to perceive that this situation as just and fair, given their own needs? And the kind of hypothesis and the way of thinking advanced in this book is simply that it's really important to address these relationships in an impartial, non-discriminatory way. If we ask young people to contribute more, well, then we also need to make sure that they are supported throughout their lives. I mean, can they get the housing they need? Can they get the education they need? Can they get the support they need if they become unemployed or sick? Well, if so, if we have that structure in place, then it will also seem much more reasonable for them to carry their fair share of this increasing burden. So that's the general perspective that we advance, and how to flesh out this more inclusive, universalist policy structure that will need to be fleshed out in different ways in different contexts. But it is clearly very important here to begin with a close empirical mapping of existing social policies and the age differentiation and age-related inequalities that's in there, and hopefully we kind of support that project in this book through the various methods and analytical techniques used to identify these age-related structures in social policy. So as for the final part of this question, it's worth emphasizing here that there is not one uniform or robust Swedish age-balanced response to crisis. Actually, when we look at more recent data than the one we used for the book, it seems to be the case that Sweden and also Norway are moving away from a balanced structure. In particular, there are cutbacks to retirement pensions over the past few years. It's too early to say if this is a clear fundamental shift or if it's just a temporary deviation from a stable pattern when it comes to a balanced structure. But clearly we can also see rapidly increasing inequalities in the Swedish context. And there are different actors in here, there are different views. It's not one uniform Swedish response. But we'd like to be optimists here also, because crises generate opportunities. And in the case of the pandemic, which is of course a very special situation, but it has made it obvious that Sweden has had great problems, for instance, in the stability and working conditions in healthcare institutions, and especially elderly care institutions, that there have been poor income support, or at least there have been problems. I mean, there are problems for many groups to stay at home if they are sick. These are some problems that have become very visible and obvious during this pandemic, and there is now a growing discussion in Sweden about, what would the post-pandemic situation look like? We cannot go back to what we had before, but we need to rebuild our welfare state and turn it into something better than we have at the moment. So this is an opportunity to kind of restructure and perhaps even radicalize a universal welfare state. And the idea of a balanced welfare contract, age-balanced welfare contract, is clearly very important in that context. When it comes to the environmental crisis, it's also, I think, important to see that this in many ways underscores the relevance of universalism in social policy, because it's clear that we cannot move ahead with radical measures, the radical measures we need to tackle climate change and the current crisis, if we do not combine environmental taxes and fees with robust social policies that make such transitions feasible for people to accept. We've seen that in the Yellow Vest movement, for instance, people reacting to increasing fuel prices, for instance. If high taxes will lead to will make it more difficult for disadvantaged groups, for instance, to cover their living costs, then this will generate resistance. So through universal policies, inclusive policies that would be that it needs to be part of a successful policy response to this crisis, make transitions feasible, make sure that the rising costs from environmental taxes, for instance, does not make living expenses much higher for disadvantaged groups. So there are important links, again, between universalism and dealing with the environmental crisis. So let me now turn to the fourth and final question, which begins in Daniel's theory and how he considers age groups and birth cohorts separately. Now, clearly, our book focuses on relationships between age groups, or more specifically, age-related risk categories. And we're very explicit about the fact that we do not address relations between birth cohorts. We do not, for instance, build on longitudinal data. We do not follow birth cohorts over life courses. We don't look at how different birth cohorts fare relative to other birth cohorts over time. And there is a specific question here. I mean, what elements do we think should be the standard for conducting a future study based on this study? What benefit ratio is appropriate for equity between birth cohorts? So this is an interesting question, and it gives us an opportunity to say a bit more about the nature and limitations of our project. Now, our book focuses on social citizenship rights. So we focus on benefits, how rights are designed in different countries with respect to age-related risk groups. Now, one limitation that we mention in the book, but that's made relevant by this question, is that we do not look systematically at the contribution side of things. We do not look at duties or obligation and how these kind of contributions and the burdens are shared between different categories. And that's something that could be addressed more fully in future research. Most of the programs that we do study, the social insurance programs, have kind of work conditionality based in them. Unemployment insurance, for instance, and also, of course, retirement pensions are largely based on past contributions. But that's something that could be studied more fully in the future. When it comes to the question of birth cohorts, the people born different points in time, that they will face different circumstances and conditions. This is something that has been studied by others. And we could just bring some authors to attention here. Louis Chavel, for instance, who looks at this idea of sacrificed generations. Jörg Tremmel discusses a young generation under pressure. So people born and bundles of birth cohorts, people born around a certain time, face particular difficulties and challenges and seem disadvantaged relative to other birth cohorts. That's not something that we discuss more systematically in this book. Another limitation is that, I mean, we look here primarily at descriptive and explanatory questions on institutions and outcomes of age-related social policies. So, I mean, we're interested in when and why and how universalism operates, and looking at this age dimension of universalism. So we don't really tackle this more fundamental philosophical question, I mean, about appropriate standards in the sense of just or desirable. I mean, we discussed that briefly, but the bulk of the contribution here is really on the more empirical side of things. Now, you could say just something about the rationale behind this choice of emphasis. If we are primarily interested in universalism, legitimacy of ambitious welfare states, we do think, I mean, this is speculation, largely speculation, but there are the reasons to think that a kind of here and now perspective on how welfare states treat different age-related risk groups, how social support for different categories, how this is experienced by different categories of citizens in their everyday lives. That's something that's probably especially fundamental when it comes to these processes of loyalty, support for welfare state arrangements, because it's so closely linked to institutional accountability and political legitimacy compared to a life course perspective. I mean, focusing on how people fared in the distant past or in the distant future, and the kind of long-term inequalities that may arise between birth cohorts. And a reason for that is simply that these things are affected by so very many things, and many of which perhaps are not strongly linked to welfare state arrangements or institutional structures. I mean, one generation is struck by, I mean, there's a world war or a pandemic or environmental crisis or enormous economic restructuring, business cycle, economic transformations, rapid health developments, I mean, medical findings, economic progress affecting life prospects and opportunities in fundamental ways. Much of this is obviously related to other things than deliberate decisions made by policies or institutional structures of the state. This is speculation, but supporting the idea that this more here and now perspective, looking at how different groups fare relative to other group here and now and how this is perceived, that's kind of fundamentally important to people's commitments and support for welfare state structures in a way that these long-term inequalities may not be. Still, just to say something about this, we do think that attention to deep and systematic birth court inequalities is clearly important. It's important for justice. I mean, for instance, one idea in Rawls's theory of justice is that next generation shouldn't be worse off, should be no worse than, I mean, their prospects should not be worse than our own. And to some extent also clearly our sense of legitimacy, the legitimacy of welfare state institutions are likely to be affected, I mean, to some extent by these fundamental inequalities between birth courts. So this is just to highlight some of the limitations of our project, something about the rationale behind our project, but also avenues for connections between neighboring discussions here that provides potential for future research. We should look more systematically at the contribution side of welfare state when it comes to inequalities between age groups and clearly the role of deep birth court inequalities. These are important topics for future research on the generational welfare contract. So we want to thank you again for all this very interesting input and for the opportunity to present our work in this context. Thank you so much.